they had this amazing set of axioms. And one of their axioms is you can't get there from here, but you can get here from there. So I love that idea. Trying to project out into the future. If you start thinking about all the permutations, you could wind up on many different paths. But if you know the desired future, you can, of course, work your way back to where you are today.
Today on Strategy Shorts, I'm joined by Douglas Ferguson, who is the president of Voltage Control. But Douglas, rather than me messing up an introduction about who you are and what you're doing in the world, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
I'm Douglas Ferguson, founder of Voltage Control. We're a facilitation academy. We help leaders grow and become collaborative leaders through learning facilitation skills and diving into how they can apply those in the workplace. And I'm excited to talk about facilitation today.
Now, for anyone who was browsing your LinkedIn profile, they'd see quite a lot of technical skills, some engineering stuff. And we can see behind you that there is like a mountain of musical equipment and technical wizardry. So give me a bit of background as to your backstory before Voltage Control. Like, what were you up to? And perhaps you could explain like some of the stuff that's going on around you.
Yeah, of course. Going way back, I was the kind of kid that really loved to just take stuff apart and put it back together. Sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't. So just kind of an innate curiosity about how things worked. And I think that led me to become a systems thinker in a lot of ways, which, led to ultimately Voltage Control. I got there by way of software technology. Most of my career was spent writing code and then becoming a leader of coders and people that define what code we're going to build. And typically in later parts of that journey, holding the title as Chief Technology Officer. So working right alongside the CEO around how do we build and deploy the products that we want to put out into the world. And as far as the stuff around me, another big aspect of my personality is I'm a musician. And so I am in a recording studio / office. And there's a lot of recording equipment behind me. And that's probably a whole nother podcast episode into how some of this stuff works and what it all is. But I just finished a construction project recently and was able to move my office out of the spare bedroom down here into the studio, because during the pandemic, I had started to amass a home gym and had taken over parts of the recording studio. And so I just finished building a home gym so I could relocate all the Pilates and boxing equipment. And so now I have my office inside the studio, which is really brilliant because I can fuse those two creative parts of my life all in one space. And it feels really connected now, which I love.
That's awesome. Now, I'm sure you've seen some of these on YouTube, but people like show their desk setup where they show like the different gadgets and knobs and things from Elgato that they're using, like the Stream Deck. I know that you've got a big one of those and I've got a very, very small one of those. Breaking the fourth wall a bit here, perhaps, but before we hit the record button, you did show me some of your technical excellence on your desk. And guys, it is remarkable. The amount of technology that you can't see that's in front of Douglas would blow your mind. And he can pull off some pretty incredible stunts. But again, maybe that's another podcast episode entirely. Now,
well, engineer, it is possible for me to quickly pivot and show folks. So there's a little glimpse at what's behind the scene here.
Honestly, guys, before the episode started, we were having a lot of fun diving into all this together. There's been lots of tomfoolery behind the scenes. Now, I wanted to ask you, so you engineer, musician, and it sounds like you kind of arrived at facilitation in a fairly unconventional way, in a fairly unconventional route that perhaps would surprise some people. So I'm kind of interested how you knew it was time to make that break from your career path as it had been laid out before into voltage control and into kind of taking a community of facilitation learners on that journey with you?
Well, it's interesting that you say that it's unconventional, and I would agree with you. But also, there's an interesting element there, which is every facilitator I meet has taken an unconventional route. Now, there's some routes that may be more apparent or more obvious, or they kind of make more sense, if you will. Like the dots connect more easily in the mind as far as the leaps and turns. Whereas, my journey almost feels a bit on the surface, it sounds like, wow, you took a big U-turn. But if you listen to my podcast, I dig into one of the first question I ask everyone is, how did you get your start? And whether I'm interviewing one of our alumni or interviewing someone who's been in the space for a really, really long time, that origin story is always really fascinating, because rarely does someone go to college and think to themselves from a young age, this aspirational goal of being a facilitator. And there's often the sentiment of being the accidental facilitator. And I would say a large majority of our alumni even talk about the fact that they don't identify as a facilitator, but it's a big part of what they do and a big part of what makes them successful in whatever title or role that they are pursuing. So, in that way, we're all a bit unconventional as facilitators, right? Like, we're all out there carving our own paths, finding that these skills and these ways of working can really unlock a lot of potential and make things possible that were quite frankly inaccessible for teams and groups previously. Now, with that
Mm,
long preamble, I'll get just to the heart of your question, which is, I started off writing code, being a coder, which often, it brings up the image or the stereotype of someone in a cave. Um, not that I'm not like I like building my caves, but and you don't see this image of someone who's standing in front of a group and trying to use conversation to guide us to a result. And the thing is that as I started to become really successful in my work, I got asked to take on leadership responsibilities. And I quickly realized that when you're becoming really good at being an individual contributor, your individual skills are really important. You have to get really good at doing those things, and you become known for being good at them, and you become respected for doing a really good job at those things. And that's kind of what's expected, or that's at least the trajectory and target and the focus that we're all on when we're in that mode. When you start to move into leadership, it's a different perspective we have to take on, right? Like, how are we making the people around us successful? And I started to think a lot about what made for sustainable and highly effective teams. How do we make our development processes truly collaborative? How do we create products in a way that is enjoyable and helps people work together in the best ways they can? And so I started just voraciously consuming lots of content around this topic. Everything from you know, um, lean and agile to things like, before that, there was extreme programming and the five dysfunctions of teams. And, Amy Edmondson's fearless organization came a bit later. But, and of course, Covey is a classic, and the importance of trust. And so I was like super interested in all this stuff. And I think it was really when I started to see how design thinking was starting to really take root in a lot of companies. And IBM in Austin was hiring a bunch of designers, and there was a lot of design thinking types of workshops happening. And I just started to notice a bit of a burgeoning industry there. And then my friend Jake Knapp started. Um, well, he published the book, because I'd been in correspondence around the blog post, but then the book came out and there's a lot of energy around that. And it started to click for me that, oh, okay, so these skills that I'm interested in for my team and making my team really successful are really broadly applicable across industries and across teams and across different kinds of organizations. And so I got really interested in how I might take that to market. And I think that curiosity started to emerge right around the time that my last startup was starting to kind of uh, get into some financial difficulties. And they were starting to talk about layoffs. And, as one of the highest paid employees, I said, you know what, I'm going to actually volunteer myself for this round of layoffs and go pursue this other thing that I'm interested in.
I think one of the things that sounds really interesting about voltage control is the different worlds that it brings together. We talked about how everyone kind of takes their own path towards facilitation, and often it's something that you adopt rather than something that you choose, or you rise up through the ranks, and all of a sudden it's your
Mm,
responsibility. I guess an interesting mirror to that is when we talk about collaboration, lots of people mean throw a bunch of people in a room, get them talking, and they'll just come up with some great ideas. But as you and I both know, that's not collaboration. That's chaos. Like collaboration requires a process and a rhythm, and you as the leader or the facilitator, it's your job to be present to what the group needs to help it move forward. So it really is an art form. But I love the way that voltage control, I guess, is providing a bit of an arc really to kind of gather up those kind of thinkers, those kind of people, regardless of how they got there, and sort of giving them a pasture where they can spend time together learning from each other. Yeah, so I think the idea of presence for leaders and facilitators is so important, to be alive to what the group needs. And as you say, like how do you move the group forward? How do you take people on that journey? How do you remain switched on to what the requirements of the group are? Now, it's really, really interesting to hear the story of voltage control, how you got there, but also the kind of when you knew it was right to make that leap and make that change. And it almost seems like the universe kind of gave you that moment and said, hey, look, there's going to be some changes in your career. Why don't you make this the moment? Jump on this trend, this opportunity space that, as you say, your friend Jake Knapp had written about and was emerging. So really great to understand that part of your story. Now, I know that you've been thinking about something for the Strategy Shorts audience today, like a framework, a tool, or an insight. And I think we're going to be talking specifically to facilitators. But often when guests bring something to the show, it's always applicable in other areas of life as well. I mean, these are tools that you can apply in all sorts of different places. So before you go into detail about what you want to share with the audience, what is it in a nutshell? And who do you think it's really
mm.
for? Like, who's the audience that you really want to engage today?
Yeah, the tool or concept that I'm sharing is called workshop design. And it's a fairly descriptive name. It's a tool for designing workshops. It's based around and inspired by a body of work in the learning experience design space. So instructional designers and folks that are trying to create the best educational experiences, learning environments where we can get the best out of the moments that we have together with students so we can drive better outcomes. And if you think about it, anytime we want to gather people, even if we're not trying to teach them something per se, we want to gather people in a way that's truly collaborative, that we're going to drive to some outcome. It's really important we think of that as a learning experience. For instance, let's say that we show up to a session and Susan has some really great ideas, but they're coming from a different perspective. She's thinking about the problem in a whole new way. There's no chance that I'm going to understand fully what the context and potential of her idea is unless I'm able to adopt her perspective. And in order to adopt her perspective, I have to get into a learning mindset because there's new information, there's new concepts, there's new vantage points that I need to consider. And so, if we're able to adopt good learning principles and apply them to how we design gatherings of all types, whether that's a team meeting that we're having on a regular cadence, or it's a very special session that we're having to make a really critical decision, or it could even be a community gathering. It could be work that we're doing for a client. The workshop design canvas and the principles behind it are really powerful. And interestingly enough, if you look at people that are really pros at designing great experiences and great workshops, they're doing this potentially intuitively, even if they're not stepping through a canvas like we've created. And so the canvas allows folks that are just getting started or just wanting to mix things up and to apply a little more rigor to how they're designing stuff. They can take a step back, walk through the canvas, and start to normalize some of these ways of approaching their design.
So, workshop design canvas, and this is something that is going to help people step into that learning mindset. And the way you kind of understand this is that actually, whatever kind of meeting you need to have, whether it's a town hall, community gathering, that actually applying this approach is going to expand the horizons of what that meeting can do, be, and achieve. So why don't you take us through it? And as you said, some people might be doing this intuitively, which is really interesting because I wonder, I came up doing community work and running workshops for young people and members of the community. And there's a bit of me that's thinking, oh, I wonder if some of this is going to sound very familiar, even though I haven't met the workshop design canvas yet. So it's going to be really interesting for me. Why don't you take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. And for those listening along, if you're in front of a computer or just want to follow up later, we have the full canvas and information about it and a video as well. That's all free access at voltagecontrol.com/workshop design canvas. And we'll get that put in the show notes as well. But essentially, it's based off and rooted in this concept of backwards design. And so in learning experience design and in most educational contexts, instructional designers will first think about what are the outcomes, what are the learning objectives we're seeking to reach. And we'll think about that end state. And then we'll work our way backwards till we get to the starting point. We'll say, okay, if we want to reach those learning objectives, what must be true just prior to finishing that learning experience? Or what's true at the very end? That's ultimately our goal. And then we're saying what's true before that and before that, all the way until we get to the very end. Very powerful way to think about our designs, because often we say, okay, how are we going to start? We just kind of throw some stuff in an order that seems to make sense, but it's not necessarily building into this destination. So starting at the destination and working our way backwards. A little shout out to MG Taylor, which is one of my favorite frameworks from Matt and Gail Taylor. They're OG facilitators from the 70s. We just lost Gail Taylor last year. So loving memory of her. They had this amazing set of axioms. And one of their axioms is you can't get there from here, but you can get here from there. So I love that idea. Trying to project out into the future. If you start thinking about all the permutations, you could wind up on many different paths. But if you know the desired future, you can, of course, work your way back to where you are today. And so in order to do that, the canvas is focused on two bookends. On the right-hand side, we've got our learner after. That's how we're imagining they're exiting or how we want them to exit. And we have our learner before. So first we think about what is true or what do we want to be true about our learner as they're exiting our session or our time together. And then what do we know is true about how they're entering, or what have we assumed about the way they're entering the space? And if anyone's familiar with design thinking, there's a little nod to an empathy map there because we're looking at what they're saying, what they're doing, how they're feeling, etc. We're also, from an educational standpoint, we're looking at what are their motivators, because motivations are very important. Because if we don't tap into their motivations, it's really hard to get them engaged. So understanding their motivations will allow us to better understand how they're entering as well. Also, in the learner after, we're distinguishing between what we're hoping to drive as an outcome for the student or for the attendee, and also our objectives as well. So we're holding those two things as separate, because distinguishing those is really important, because they may not be the same thing. They may support each other, but understanding the differences and how we design to make both those things possible, really important. And we can't really have one without the other. So once we've identified these two ends, now we can see the gap that it's our responsibility to fill. And without really understanding that gap, it's nearly impossible to design a great workshop. And, coming back to the point I said about motivations and the learner before, well, I kind of hinted at how do we assume they're entering. So if we're not confident they're entering in that way, we might want to check and verify that they are showing up in the way that we anticipated. But it's hard to assess that if we haven't predetermined it, or at least decided what we think that is. It's very similar to, it's really hard to manage something without metrics. We can't say if we're doing well if we haven't established our KPIs yet. So similarly, we need to decide up front, how do we think they're entering? And then when they show up, we can verify if that's the case. And that allows us to be adaptable in our facilitation. If we do that assessment and it turns out they're not showing up in ways we had expected, then we can say, what am I going to change right now in the moment because of this new information that I'm taking in? And so assessment points is actually the next step. And that's where you look across that gap and think about, okay, what assessment points do I want along the way? I personally like to, again, start at the end and work my way forward. So thinking, well, if I want people to leave in a certain way, what might I need to do to confirm that they are leaving how I expected? And it could just be as simple as planning a debrief and crafting some of my prompts in a way that will give me the information that I'm seeking to know at that point. And if we do assessment points along the way, we can guarantee that we're taking the group to the places we intend to take them. Because it's not our job to show up and run a bunch of activities. It's our job to drive to outcomes and get people on a journey, making progress along the way. And if we're not doing assessment points, there's no way we can measure if we're actually making the progress that we had this desire to make. And then, of course, we've got some other checklists along the way. Once you've got assessments in place, then you're looking at activities. And that's kind of generally, with more inexperienced people, will just generally start with the activities and think, okay, how do I sequence some activities together? But if you do these other steps first, you really make it informative and a bit more or less arbitrary around what we're putting in. And we have a little bit more of a why. It's more intentional and purposeful. And then we've got some tips inside the canvas around how to think about activities and making them differentiated. So if people are showing up with different goals, different needs, different capabilities, thinking about how we make our activities multimodal. So we engage those folks that might be more tactile learners and tactile engagers versus more cerebral folks versus more verbal folks. So we're thinking about how activities show up in different ways to support that multimodal participation and engagement, and how we differentiate for those different types of people that are showing up. And then, of course, there's a few other checklists that get into the neuroscience of learning, metacognition, things that we want to make sure we're considering to round out our experience so we get the best outcome. That's the workshop design canvas in a nutshell.
For me, this is somewhat of an eye-opener, because as you've been talking through this, I've realized that one of the functions of this canvas is that it actually frees the facilitator from being the creative genius behind the workshop. Because as soon as you actually start with the outcome first and you start thinking, okay, if this is the outcome that we want to achieve, then you start thinking, what is the best activity that helps us move towards that goal, rather than starting with an abstract idea of what the workshop could be and trying to design ideas around that. And I think it adds a systematized way into thinking about that workshop and that process, which I think is really, really interesting. But then beyond that, I like to think about what are the other ways that this approach could be used in other settings. And quite clearly, when you start thinking about the outcome first and then working back, I love that phrase, you can't get there from here, but you can get here from there. And in a sales context, for example, if you think about okay, the person that I'm having the sales call with, I want them to feel a certain way. How am I going to get them into that emotional space? Or I want them to really understand not the thing that we sell, but the benefit it gives them. How am I going to lead up into that landing point? Like, it begins to frame a whole bunch of different conversations when you start thinking with the end in mind, first of all. So I think this is really, really applicable in lots of different places. Now, we're coming into land, Douglas, which is a great shame, because I think that there's loads in the workshop design canvas that we could really, really deep dive. And I'm sure in Voltage Controller on your podcast, you probably spend a whole episode talking about one or two of these things at a time. But this is Strategy Shorts, which is a blessing and a curse at times. But if you were to direct our listeners and viewers to one thing that they should take action with today, or one step they should take in engaging with this approach, where would you recommend they start?
I'd say head over to voltagecontrol.com/workshop-design-canvas and check out the canvas, download it, experiment with it on something that you've done in the past that you'd like to improve on, or if you've got something coming up that you know you want to make really excellent, then it's really important that you make it as best as you can. It's worth giving it a spin. It will definitely shift the way you approach it. And to your point about freeing you from the creative tension, if you will, I like to think about it as focusing your creativity. You know, the system allows you to shine a flashlight on where the important decisions are, and then you can funnel that creativity into places that really matter, and then you can get more bang for your buck.
I think that's a great way to view it. A tool for focusing your creative attention, your creative energy, and helping you to lean into the really critical things that workshop needs for people to get amazing results from it. Douglas, as I said, we're coming into land. We're about done for our time together. I'll make sure that I put that link in the show notes for people, so people can go and get their hands on that, get their heads around that, and plan for the next meeting or workshop they've got coming up. But we're about done for time. It's been great. Thank you so much for making some time for the show, and let's speak again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.